No, not at all. We've still got commitment from industry leaders to continue through the process. We've taken their recommendations. We've gone back with some questions, actually not too much deviation from what they advised us. And we're listening to other farmers around the country as well to make sure that what we've put in place, the farmers understand why and they can buy into it.
But Federated Farmers thinks that you've broken the promise of the partnership and they're actually thinking of pulling out. I mean, that makes it look like a mess.
Well, I'd be disappointed. They've been part of the process all the way through. It's not a huge deviation from what was brought to government, but I'm not going to prejudge what they might do. But I hope, for the good of their members and future generations of farmers, that they stick with it and we work on what is an agreed solution.
Because beef and lamb don't like the changes either, the industry seems split. That's not the result you were hoping for from a partnership.
Look, it's been a big task. You know, these are sectors that have a whole lot of different land management programs and processes around success and profitability. So it's not surprising that it took a while. You know, they reached a point, you know, of general agreement, and what we're putting back with questions is not too far from that. So questions over how we set the price, questions over how we account for sequestration. Yeah. It's not that it's excluded, while the papers say these are areas that we haven't included at the moment. The question is, have we calculated the sequestration the right way, and what should we change?
So they seem to be the two major sticking points, don't they? For the price, the farmers would like a say in it, but your suggestion is that government ministers set the price. Why won't you?
Ultimately they do. It says that, but we're obliged to consult with them and with iwi as well. So
they will have a voice? They will have a voice?
Absolutely they will, as the paper says, and the Climate Commission will be providing us advice as well. So no one's excluded from this at all. In terms of the revenue that is generated, there's an advisory panel, and so, you know, the industry will be part of that as well.
What about sequestration? So, you know, some farmers are upset that they only get some of their planting offset against the emissions. Why can they not, which is what they wanted, have all their planting offset?
Because as their paper says, there's a scientific work needed in some of these areas. Really small woodlots, you've got windrows, you've got single trees that all do sequester carbon. The question of how much and then what happens if they blow over are really important things. We don't want to burden farmers unnecessarily with a system that means they're running around accounting for every single tree. So, and the Climate Change Commission said that as well. We might take a little longer to sort through the process that means it's a sensible system. It's reasonably accurate. It won't be perfect.
But you might be left with a system where the farmers are paying a levy but not getting any incentives back.
No, they are. They are getting incentives back for riparian planting and for other woodlots.
But not for all planting.
No, because some of them are very small and it might not be worth the effort to account for the sequestration. We want to make sure that we're not imposing upon farmers a system that costs them more than they get credits for.
So the modelling shows in sheep and beef farms that they could face a 20% drop in production. That's the figure that's been touted. If that happens...
That's a net revenue,
yeah,
and maybe a loss of 7% of the area. It's not 20% of the sector leaving.
No,
and so that's been misrepresented.
20% of production.
Yeah, but production doesn't necessarily equate to productivity or profitability. And so there are a number of factors that play into that as well.
So you're saying that's not as doomsday as being suggested?
No, I don't think it is. And every single farm will be in a different position to take on that challenge. I'm not saying it's not an impact, and I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but I think that having watched what the sheep and the dry stock sector has done in previous decades, there's been an average reduction of about 12% of the area in beef and lamb farming over the past 3 decades. What we're projecting here is maybe a 7% from this. I accept that the ETS and forest planting is another component that's putting pressure on that sector. But we've seen, on average, high levels of reduction in area over the 3 previous decades, and it hasn't destroyed the industry at all.
But what about the communities that rely on the industry that may change to forestry or just give up on farming? Are you worried about those communities?
Yes, we are. Of course we are. And we've seen, you know, changes through the 80s, the 90s. All those communities have been impacted in some way. With technology, we've seen a boost in the people moving out into some of those rural areas. They're working online, so it's not just shearers and people working in forestry who live in rural areas.
Is the modelling that you're basing this on too optimistic? Because it does assume that methane-reducing injections and genetics will be available and has taken that into account. If it's not available, the impact could be greater?
No, I think they've very conservatively taken that on board, and so they're looking at those technologies that are in the pipeline. In fact, the view is that with some of those things, if they're proven to be correct, we can actually, leap ahead of the projections in terms of the 10% by 2030, and then the target's yet to be set beyond that.
But people like Federated Farmers are telling me that they're not so sure those technologies will be available, and if they're not, it could see almost a 30% drop in production in the sheep and beef sector.
Look, there's nothing sure in the world today, but what we do know, there's a huge amount of effort going in to try and identify technologies to reduce emissions across the board.
And the same modelling shows that if sheep farmers reduce emissions, competing high-emitting countries might take up that market share and sheep emissions might rise as a result. So is all of this pain that could happen worth it?
Look, that's a possibility. There's some research that says that it's unlikely that we'll see a shift and a transfer of that production. We're producing high-value, high-quality products that shift into the market. There's no guarantee that others can replace us.
But this is in the consultation document that says that this could happen.
It could, and I think there have been some studies done that have said that it won't. Now, I'm not getting into the debate on that. Of course, that's a possibility that people could step into that breach.
This is about reducing emissions. And if we reduce emissions here and they rise elsewhere, what are we gaining?
Look, we're a relatively small emitter in international terms. Where we can really make a difference is the technologies that we develop here. If we share those technologies with the rest of the world, particularly when it comes to livestock protein production, we can have a huge impact. And our efforts here can be, spread and shared around the world. That's where the real impact will occur.
So does that mean that there's like the sheep and beef industry are being used as an experiment to reduce emissions so we can be branded around the world as an emissions leader?
No, look, in 1997 we committed agriculture to part of our emissions reduction program. That was done by actually Simon Upton as Minister then. 25 years on, we're still grappling with how we do that. It is 48% of our total profile. We have to do our bit. If we as a biological food production system country, we will be probably the most impacted by climate change. We rely on biological systems, we rely on a pretty steady climate. We're facing some major disruption. We have to get other countries to do their bit, and we have to do our bit and lead by example.
So it's not about branding or positioning New Zealand as an emissions reducer?
Well, it can be if we get on and do it and we're successful. Of course it can.
Well, let's talk trade. That's your other ministerial hat. Let's talk China. China's economy is slowing, its population's getting older. Why are we still playing the risky game of depending on China for most of our trade?
Of course.
It's still 30%, isn't it?
It is indeed 30+%. And I've said to companies, if you are reliant on one customer, hugely reliant, then you're slightly exposed and your business model is risky.
And if that customer turns to custard, what's the plan B? Where do they go instead?
Exactly, and that's what I've asked the companies, what is there? They can't expect government to shift, their export profile. Many of them
But you open the doors, right?
Correct. We've opened the doors in the EU and the UK. We're working in other areas. We've signed up RCEP and we've got CPTPP. So we've done a lot of work in 5 years, 4 brand new trade agreements and 2 upgrades. That's a significant opportunity for exporters.
Okay. If, for example, President Xi invades Taiwan, will New Zealand still continue to trade with China?
Look, those are decisions that will be made at the time. We have a very strong and healthy commercial relationship with both Taiwan and with China. We have a one China policy, we always respect that, but we have, as I say, very valuable commercial relationships that benefit not just New Zealand, but the people buying our products. I'm sure that will continue, but we're not going to prejudge what might happen.
And personally, as Trade Minister, are you happy, even without an invasion, to continue trading with China, regardless of things like the internment camps full of Uyghurs?
Look, we speak out on some of those issues at the right time, in the right way. China respects our position on that, but they also respect our right to trade commercially with them.
In terms of opening doors, Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta says a free trade agreement with India it's not a priority, and that's one of the largest economies in the world. Why not?
Well, it's not a priority because India have clearly expressed to us numerous occasions that they're not going to do a deal with dairy, and dairy is our single biggest export. So I went over there. We can build really strong and valuable relationships with India without a free trade agreement. We don't have one with the US. We have an incredible opportunity to build the kind of relationship in India that we have with the US without a free trade agreement.
Are we being left behind at the moment?
No, we're not. No, we're not. And Australia's just signed an agreement in principle, and they've got to work through that. And in some areas like sheep meat, they might have an advantage over us. So we just have to be realistic and balance up our efforts in trade negotiations with the reality of what we can deliver.
So if not India, who next? Which is the next biggest country that we can diversify to?
Look, the Middle East and the GCC, we had a trade agreement almost over the line, 2009, that was parked because of internal issues there. We've been back talking with them, both into Saudi and to UAE.
Yes.
And they are reliant, of course, on the importation of food, but they're developing their own sectors. And I think that it'll be in the services area, it'll be in IP and technology where we can make huge gains.
But just on the Middle East, I mean, what's your personal philosophy when you're dealing with these countries and you disagree with the human rights? Like the Saudis are known for executions.
Yeah, I mean, we speak out, we're appropriate, but nonetheless, there are commercial relationships that are separate from that, and I leave those issues for the most part to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. My job is to open the doors for commercial opportunities that underpin, our country.
How do you balance the commercial opportunities versus the human rights?
That's politics, that balance is one of the things that not only New Zealand but every other country in the world is trying to work through in some really challenging and disruptive times.